The Model 1898 Krag weighed about 9 pounds. It carried a 30-inch barrel and fed 5 rounds of 30-40 from a gate on the side of the receiver. Yet it was not built to shoot fast. It was built to make a soldier shoot slowly and well. A cutoff switch sealed the 5 rounds in reserve. An officer decided when to release them. A rifleman fed 1 cartridge at a time. The doctrine trusted the aimed shot over the volley. That small idea produced a national program. Springfield Armory built more than 500,000 of them. 2 Norwegians, Krag and Jørgensen, had drawn the design. The rifle then escaped the range. It went to Cuba, up San Juan Hill, into Philippine garrisons, and onto civilian gun racks. Every advantage was paid for somewhere else. Its smoothness capped its power. Its discipline cost it speed. The rifle that taught America to shoot carefully met an enemy who shot fast and could not be seen. It was neither an obsolete relic nor a modern failure. It occupied the space between the rifle America already had and the rifle America would soon need. The country that adopted it had spent the 1880s watching Europe change. France had fielded smokeless powder in 1886. Germany had followed with a magazine rifle of its own. The United States still issued a single-shot arm that fired black powder and marked every man who pulled the trigger with a cloud of white smoke. The Krag was the answer to that embarrassment. It was modern where the old rifle was ancient. It was smooth where the old rifle was crude. It fed from a magazine where the old rifle fed 1 shot at a time. The rifle also came with a lineage. Denmark had adopted an early Krag in 1889, and Norway would take its own version in 1894. The United States became the 3rd nation to place the design in service, and the only one to fight a major war with it. That shared parentage said something about the moment. The world was changing rifles all at once, and America was reaching abroad to keep pace. That answer came with a philosophy attached. The Army did not want a rifle that let men empty a magazine in panic. It wanted a rifle that rationed its own firepower. The magazine cutoff expressed that wish in steel. A soldier loaded 5 rounds, then flipped a lever that locked them away. He fired single shots fed by hand. The 5 rounds waited for the order that released them. The design assumed a certain kind of battle, fought at deliberate range, won by marksmanship rather than volume. The choice would be judged, in the end, by a war no one at the board had planned for. A rifle is designed for one job, and history keeps handing it another. The Krag was drawn for a battle of lines and volleys and careful shooting. Within 6 years, it stood on a tropical hillside against a rifle that fought by different rules, and everything the board had praised would be weighed again in a harder court. The question underneath the whole story is simple to state and hard to answer. How do you choose a nation's rifle for a war that has not happened yet? The men who selected the Krag chose for the war they imagined. They imagined disciplined lines and aimed fire. History handed them something else. The rifle they built would travel from European trials to the Springfield factory floor, from Cuban ridges to Philippine jungles, from ordnance boards to surplus racks and hunting camps. It would be praised and condemned by the same army within a decade. Chapter 1. The Army that still fought with smoke. By 1890, the United States infantry still carried a single-shot rifle. Every other major power had already moved past it. The rifle was the 45-70 Springfield, the armed soldiers called the trapdoor. It had entered service in 1873, and it had served through the Indian Wars and the long quiet of the frontier posts. It loaded 1 cartridge through a hinged breech that flipped up like a small door, and the design gave it its name. It was strong, simple, and accurate. It fired a heavy lead bullet driven by a charge of black powder, and that powder was the problem. It was a relic of an older war carried into a new one. Black powder announced its user. Each shot threw a cloud of white smoke into the air. On a still day, a company firing in line vanished behind its own haze, and the smoke hung there, marking the position long after the bullets had gone. The enemy did not need to see the men. He needed only to see the smoke. The powder also fouled the bore. Shot after shot, a crust of residue built in the barrel in the action, and a rifle fired hard through a long fight grew stiff and dirty in a soldier's hands. That limitation had not mattered much on the frontier. It mattered enormously against a modern army. A soldier with a trapdoor fired, then broke the action, then thumbed a fresh cartridge into the chamber by hand. A trained man managed perhaps a dozen aimed rounds a minute. He did it while standing in a fog of his own making. Every element of the weapon pointed backward. Its power came at the cost of speed. Its accuracy came at the cost of concealment. The man in the open paid both prices at once, and he paid them in full view of whoever was shooting back. Europe had already chosen differently. France adopted the Lebel in 1886 and put smokeless powder into general service. That powder changed the battlefield. It burned cleaner, drove bullets faster, and left almost no smoke. A rifleman with smokeless powder could fire from cover and stay hidden while he did it. Germany answered within 2 years, fielding the Gewehr 1888 and its own smokeless cartridge. These rifles fed from magazines and fired flatter and farther than anything in American hands. The gap was not small. It was a generation wide, and the United States Army knew it. The knowledge sat uncomfortably in the Ordnance Department. American gunmakers had built fine rifles for decades, and in the world of sporting arms and repeating actions, the country led anyone. In the standard infantry rifle, it did not. No domestic military design had crossed fully into the smokeless magazine age. The nation that armed the frontier was behind the armies it measured itself against, and it could read the measurement in the range tables of France and Germany. That claim deserves a moment of restraint. Popular retellings sometimes place America at the front of firearms development in this period. The record shows the opposite in military rifles. In sporting arms and repeating actions, the United States led the world, and names like Winchester carried weight everywhere. In the standard infantry rifle, it trailed France and Germany by several years, and its own board would soon admit as much in writing. The two facts sat side by side. A country could lead the gun trade and lag the Army rifle at the same time. The response came from the top of the department. Brigadier General Daniel W. Flagler, the Chief of Ordnance, moved to close the gap. On the 23rd of December, 1890, he convened a board to find a new rifle. The board would test, measure, and recommend. It would fire the candidates for accuracy and endurance. It would foul them and freeze them and work their actions until something broke. It would look at the best designs on Earth, and it would not assume the winner had to be American. That decision carried weight beyond the firing line. A national rifle was more than a tool. It was a statement of who could arm the nation. Handing the search to a board, with foreign designs invited, meant admitting that the answer might come from abroad. The admission was uncomfortable. The alternative was worse. The alternative was another decade of white smoke against enemies who had none. The change in Europe was not only about smoke. The new powder drove smaller, faster bullets, and speed rewrote the reach of the infantry rifle. The French 8mm round and the German cartridge that followed flew flatter and held their force farther than the heavy, slow lead of the trapdoor. A soldier armed with the old rifle was outranged before he could close, and outshot once he did. The gap was measured not in years alone, but in hundreds of yards of ground a modern rifle owned and an old one could not enter. The Army was not blind to repeaters. It had tried them before, in small numbers and half measures, and it had watched private makers build fine magazine rifles for the civilian trade. What it lacked was a smokeless magazine rifle fit for the whole infantry, proven and ready to issue by the hundreds of thousands. The board's charter was to find that rifle wherever it lived. The officers read the European reports, studied the foreign cartridges, and understood that the honest answer might wear a foreign name. They set out to test rather than to hope, and testing meant admitting they did not already hold the best rifle in the world. The men who ran the Ordnance Department had watched this shift for years in the reports that crossed their desks. They read of French maneuvers where whole battalions fired without a cloud, of German trials with cartridges that flew farther than anything in American stores. Each report widened the gap between what the Army carried and what a modern war would demand. The knowledge did not stay in the offices. It reached the officers who would have to lead men armed with the trapdoor against rifles like these, and it gave the search for a new rifle an urgency that the peace of the frontier could not soften. The trials also had to answer a harder question than which rifle shot best. They had to find a rifle the nation could build in the numbers a war would swallow. A fine design that could not be mass-produced was no use to an army that might need 500,000 rifles in a hurry. The board weighed manufacture alongside marksmanship, and that double test narrowed the field as much as accuracy ever did. None of this made the trapdoor a bad rifle for the war it was built to fight. It had armed the Army through hard campaigns, and it was strong, accurate, and simple to keep. Its fault was not poor design, but a changed world. The rifle had not grown worse. The battlefield had moved on around it, and left its black powder behind in a haze the enemy could aim at. A soldier on a frontier post in 1890 felt none of this directly. He cleaned his trapdoor, fired his aimed rounds, and watched his smoke drift across the parade ground. He did not know that a board in the East was about to make his rifle obsolete. He did not know that the replacement would carry a Norwegian name, or that it would be measured against a German rifle he had never seen. The board wanted the best rifle in the world. It did not much care where the world had built it. Chapter 2. 53 rifles, and not one American. The board opened its doors to every gunmaker on Earth. When it finished, the American war rifle had a Norwegian name. The call went out in 1890, and the designs arrived from across Europe and America. By the count that survives, 53 different rifles came before the board. They came from the great national arsenals and from private inventors working alone. The testing ground was Governor's Island, in New York Harbor, a short boat ride from the department that would judge them. The board did not simply fire the rifles for groups on paper. It ran them through a regime meant to break them. It tested rate of fire and penetration. It fouled the actions and worked them dirty. It exposed them to rust and dust and cold, and it counted the failures. The field of competitors read like a census of the modern rifle. There was the Lee, with its detachable box magazine, an idea decades ahead of its moment, and one that would shape rifles long after. There was the Mannlicher from Austria, feeding from a clip that dropped into the magazine hole. There was the Mauser from Germany, already moving toward the design that would define the bolt action for half a century. There was the Schmidt-Reuben from Switzerland, with its straight pull action, worked with a single back and forward stroke. Around 40 other designs filled out the trials. Each represented a different answer to the same question of how a soldier should feed and fire a repeating rifle. The winner was the Krag Jørgensen. 2 Norwegians had designed it. Colonel Ole Herman Johannes Krag directed the arms factory at Kongsberg, and Erik Jørgensen served as its superintendent. Together, they had refined the rifle through the 1880s. Denmark had adopted an early version in 1889, and the design had a track record in service before an American ever handled it. The board tested it against the finest rifles in the world and placed it first. On the 15th of September, 1892, the Krag was selected. The board had reasons that made sense at the time. The Krag's action was smooth beyond anything else in the trials, and smoothness was a quality the testers could feel in every stroke. Its single locking lug and gentle camming made the bolt glide open and shut. Its side-loading magazine could be topped up at any moment without opening the action, so a soldier could keep his rifle loaded while he replenished it. Its magazine cutoff matched American doctrine, which prized fire discipline over volume of fire. On the board's own terms, the Krag answered every question the Army was asking. Those terms carried a cost that would only appear later. The board valued smoothness, and the single lug action delivered it. That single lug also limited the pressure the rifle could safely contain. The board valued the cutoff, and the side magazine delivered it. That same magazine, filled from the side and curling upward, could not be loaded from a stripper clip pressed down through the top. Every advantage the board admired was paid for in a limitation it did not yet weigh. The rifle was chosen for what it did on a peacetime range, and the range did not test the thing that would matter most in a war. The selection provoked immediate anger. American gunmakers had submitted designs and lost to a foreign one. They protested that the trials were rigged, that the outcome had been decided before the firing began. The charge was serious, because a national rifle built abroad touched national pride, and pride had a voice in Congress. The Lee, an American-associated design, had lost to a Norwegian one, and the men who made rifles at home did not accept the verdict quietly. That anger deserves fair hearing rather than dismissal. The domestic makers had a real grievance. No American design had won the contract to arm American soldiers, and the country had the industry to build rifles by the hundreds of thousands. Whether the board was biased or simply correct, the outcome was the same. The men who built guns in Connecticut and Massachusetts watched a rifle from Kongsberg take the prize that they believed belonged at home. One myth should be corrected here. Popular accounts sometimes credit a single inventor with the Krag, as though one man had drawn it whole. The record shows 2 men, Krag and Jørgensen, working within an arms factory, atop a Danish and Norwegian lineage that ran back years. The rifle was not one genius's flash of insight. It was an institution's careful product, chosen by another institution's careful board. The story wants a lone inventor because a lone inventor is easy to remember. The truth is a committee and a factory, which is harder to picture and closer to what happened. The endurance testing was punishing by design. The board fired the rifles until parts failed, counted the malfunctions, and pushed each action through dust and rust and freezing to see what would break and when. A rifle that grouped well on a clean morning meant little if it choked after 1,000 fouled rounds. The Krag came through that ordeal near the top, and its smooth action stayed smooth when dirtier designs bound up. The board trusted what it had measured, and it had measured a great deal. The rifle that came closest to unseating it was the Lee, and the Lee's later life shows what the board passed over. Its box magazine, loaded from a clip and dropped free when empty, pointed straight at the future of the infantry rifle. The United States Navy would adopt a Lee of its own in 1895, and the same basic action, taken up in Britain, would arm an empire for half a century as the Lee Enfield. The board chose the Krag's smoothness and its cutoff over the Lee's faster magazine. It chose the feel of the action over the speed of the reload, and the war would test that choice before the decade was out. The Krag was not untried when America took it. Denmark had carried its version since 1889, and Norway would adopt one in 1894, so the design entered 3 national arsenals within a few years of one another. That shared history was part of its appeal. The board was not gambling on a prototype. It was buying a rifle that other armies had already judged worth issuing, and that judgment carried weight against the objections raised at home. The protest did not end the matter. It sent the decision back for review. American manufacturers pressed their case, and Congress listened, and the machinery of government turned to look again at a choice it had already made. The same board that had chosen the Krag would soon be asked to choose a second time, under the eyes of the men who most wanted it to change its mind. Chapter 3. Chosen twice, doubted once. Congress did not trust the verdict. It ordered the board to reconsider, and the board returned the same answer. The pressure from domestic gunmakers reached the Capitol, and Congress responded. It required a delay so that American designs could be examined once more. The intent was fair on its face. Before the nation adopted a foreign rifle, it would give its own inventors a final hearing. A pause was ordered for that purpose, and the trials reopened to anyone who thought the board had gotten it wrong. The same board reconvened. It looked again at the domestic entries, and again at the Krag. In the spring of 1893, across April and May, it ran a second round of trials with the same rifles and the same tests. The result did not change. The Krag was confirmed. On the 26th of May, 1893, it became the Army's first repeating, smokeless powder rifle, adopted for the service. The decision that had drawn so much fire was now settled twice over. That second selection settled the argument through repetition. A single verdict could be called bias. A verdict reached twice, under protest, by a board forced to look again by the very men who opposed it, was harder to dismiss. The domestic makers had received their hearing. Their designs had been fired beside the Krag a second time, and a second time the Krag had won. The board had reached the same conclusion in the open, and the openness was the point. Congress backed the decision with money. It appropriated $400,000 toward production. The Krag would be built at the National Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, the one place with the tooling and the men to make a service rifle in quantity. The designers would be paid a royalty of $1 for each rifle produced. The foreign origin was no longer just a matter of pride. It was a line in the national budget, $1 at a time, for as long as the rifles came off the line. A vignette from the trials rooms captures the tension of those months. Ordnance officers stood before skeptical congressmen and defended a rifle from Kongsberg. They argued from data, from firing tables and endurance runs, and the counted failures of 40 other designs. They were defending not only a mechanism, but a decision that America could not build its own best rifle yet. The argument was uncomfortable to make in public. It was also, on the evidence the board had gathered, correct. The officers were not choosing a foreign rifle out of preference. They were choosing the rifle that had won. The cost of certainty was time. The retesting bought confidence, and confidence had value in a decision meant to last a generation. It also bought delay. While the board deliberated a second time, Europe kept moving. The Mauser was maturing in Germany toward the design that would define the era, the rifle that would soon lock its bolt with more lugs and feed it from a clip. Every month spent confirming the Krag was a month the rival gained. The advantage of a careful choice was paid for in lost calendar, and the calendar belonged to the enemy the Krag had not yet met. One point requires restraint. Some retellings describe the adoption as a backroom deal forced through by insiders who had already picked the winner. The record shows a decision that survived a second, adversarial review demanded by its opponents. The process was contentious, and the anger was real, but it was not hidden. The board chose the Krag, was told to look again, and chose it again in front of the people who wanted a different answer. That is not the shape of a deal done in the dark. The $400,000 Congress voted was only the beginning of the cost. Springfield had to tool up for a rifle, unlike anything it had mass-produced, cutting the gauges and fixtures that would hold the Krag's fine tolerances across a long run. Setting up that production took months of careful work before the first issue rifles reached the troops. The royalty of $1 a rifle rode on top of it all, owed to Kongsberg for every unit the armory stamped. A modern rifle was not only chosen, it was bought, tooled, and paid for, line item by line item. The delay carried a hidden price that would only be named later. While America confirmed the Krag and tooled to build it, the Mauser was moving toward the design of 1898, the rifle that would set the world's standard with its third locking lug and its stronger case. By the time the Krag was fully in service, its sternest rival abroad had already improved past the point the American rifle could reach. The United States had adopted a modern rifle and, in the same stroke, guaranteed it would be a step behind the newest one. The careful choice was sound. The clock was not on its side. A national rifle was also a matter of identity, and that is why the fight ran so hot. To adopt a foreign design was to say, in public and in law, that American industry could not yet arm American soldiers with the best. For a nation proud of its inventors and its factories, that admission stung. The board's answer was not pride, but evidence. It had fired the rifles and counted the results, and the results pointed abroad. The officers chose the rifle that worked over the rifle that flattered, and they took the criticism that came with it. The first Krags reached the troops in the mid-1890s, and the men who received them found a rifle unlike anything the Army had issued. The bolt ran where the trapdoor's breech had flipped. The magazine held 5 where the old rifle held 1. The powder left little smoke where the old rifle had fogged the whole line. For a soldier raised on the trapdoor, the Krag was a glimpse of a different kind of war, quieter and quicker, and for a few years it made the American infantryman the equal of any in the world on paper. Yet the men who chose it were not fools chasing the wrong rifle. They chose for the doctrine they believed in, and that doctrine was written into the cutoff lever more plainly than into any spec sheet. To judge the Krag is first to understand what its makers were trying to make a soldier do. With adoption settled, attention turned from politics to philosophy. The rifle carried an idea inside it, and that idea was about restraint. The magazine cutoff was not a quirk of engineering. It was doctrine cast in steel, a belief about how soldiers should fight made into a lever a corporal could flip. The Army had chosen a rifle designed to keep a soldier from shooting too much. Understanding why means looking closely at the mechanism the Army loved and the belief it was built to serve. The nation had chosen its rifle, twice, and paid for it. Now it had to learn what the rifle believed. Chapter 4. 1 round at a time, on purpose. The Krag was engineered to slow the soldier down. Its most talked-about feature existed to stop him from shooting. That feature was the magazine cutoff. It was a small lever on the side of the receiver, and it governed how the rifle fed. Turned one way, it let cartridges rise from the magazine into the action, and the rifle fed itself with every stroke of the bolt. Turned the other way, it sealed the magazine off. With the cutoff engaged, the 5 rounds in the box stayed put. The soldier loaded single cartridges by hand, dropping one at a time onto the follower, and fired them one at a time. The magazine became a reserve, a sealed store of 5 rounds held back for a moment of need. The idea behind that lever was older than the rifle, and it grew out of a real fear. Armies of the period feared the magazine. They feared that a man with many rounds under his thumb would fire them all in the first minutes of a fight, and then stand there empty while the enemy closed. Ammunition was heavy, supply was slow, and a soldier who wasted his cartridges was a soldier disarmed at the worst moment. The cutoff answered that fear directly. It let an officer control the flood. His men fired deliberate single shots until he judged the moment worth the reserve. Then he gave the word, the cutoffs came off, and 5 aimed rounds came fast from every rifle at once. The doctrine had a logic that fit its era. Fire discipline won battles when ammunition was scarce and resupply was slow. A controlled volley delivered at the right instant did more than a wild stream poured out at the wrong one. The Krag's cutoff put that belief into the hands of every corporal in the line. It trusted the aimed shot over the emptied magazine. And in the world, the Army knew, that trust was reasonable. The rifle was not badly designed. It was designed for a battle that made sense until the battle changed. The mechanism that served the doctrine was a marvel of feel. The Krag's bolt was the smoothest in any service rifle of its day, and every account of the rifle returns to that smoothness. It closed on a single locking lug at the front of the bolt, with the root of the bolt handle bearing against the receiver as a second point of support. The camming surfaces were cut so cleanly that the action seemed to glide rather than slide. Soldiers who carried it remembered the motion for the rest of their lives. The bolt ran back and forward with a fluid ease that few rifles before or since have matched. That smoothness was not free. A single locking lug held the bolt shut against the pressure of firing, and one lug could hold only so much. The Krag's action was rated near 40,000 pounds of pressure, and its cartridge was loaded to respect that ceiling. A design with 2 forward lugs, like the Mauser taking shape in Germany, could hold far more, and could therefore drive a bullet harder and flatter. The Krag traded strength for grace. It bought its beautiful action by accepting a limit on its power, and the limit was fixed the moment the single lug was chosen. One myth needs correcting here. Popular retellings describe the Krag as hopelessly slow to load, a rifle a man could barely feed. That claim requires restraint. In a documented test, a trained shooter fired 43 aimed shots in 2 minutes using the magazine. The rifle was not slow in the hand. Its slowness was a matter of doctrine, not of mechanism. The cutoff made men shoot single rounds because the Army told them to, not because the rifle forced them to. A Krag worked hard by a skilled soldier was a fast rifle. A Krag worked by the book was a deliberately slow one. The real limitation lay elsewhere, and it was structural rather than doctrinal. The Krag loaded through a hinged gate on the right side of the receiver. A soldier swung the gate open, dropped cartridges into the box, and closed it, and a follower fed them up and across into the action. That system had a genuine virtue. A man could top up the magazine at any time without opening the bolt, adding rounds one by one while a live cartridge sat in the chamber ready to fire. He was never caught with an empty rifle just because he was reloading. It also had a fixed flaw that no amount of skill could cure. Because the rounds entered from the side and curled upward under the follower, the Krag could not accept a stripper clip pressed down from the top of the open action. Every cartridge went in by hand, one at a time, through the gate. The rifle that fed so smoothly could only be fed the slow way. There was a second-order cost hidden in the cartridge as well. The 30-40 was a rimmed round, its base flanged like an old revolver cartridge, and rimmed rounds could catch rim over rim in a magazine if stacked carelessly. The side gate and the single column tamed that risk, but the rim was one more reason the Krag was tied to hand-loading and closed to the clip. The belief had deep roots in how armies had fought for a century. Massed volleys, delivered on command, had broken charges and held lines since the days of the musket, and the officer's control of his men's fire was the heart of it. A magazine threatened that control. It put the decision to pour out fire in the hands of every private, and an army built on discipline distrusted that. The cutoff was the compromise between the new repeater and the old command. It gave the officer back his volley while leaving the reserve a thumb flick away. The rifle carried its own guards against accident as well. The striker could be set at a half-cock notch, a resting place that held the pin back from the primer, and the soldier learned to trust it on the march. These were small features, easy to overlook beside the famous bolt, but they were part of what made the Krag a comfortable rifle to carry all day. It was a weapon built to be lived with, not only fired, and the men who carried it felt the difference in the small things. All of it served the same idea. The Krag was meant to be a steady, controlled, deliberate rifle in the hands of a disciplined soldier, and every feature bent toward that end. The trade sat at the heart of the rifle. The side gate gave the Krag its smooth topping up and its clean, uninterrupted action. The same side gate denied it the fastest reloading method of the age. In a slow fight, the difference meant little, and the Krag's virtues carried the day. In a fast one, the difference meant everything. The advantage was real, the cost was real, and the man in the firing line would be the one to pay it. The soldier of the 1890s did not feel that cost on the range. He felt the smoothness, the accuracy, the gentle recoil of a well-balanced rifle, and he flipped the cutoff as doctrine instructed. Understanding why one lug and one gate would matter so much means following a single cartridge through the action, from the gate to the ground. Chapter 5. The Firing Cycle. A cartridge began its journey in the palm of a hand. It ended as brass spinning to the dirt. Between those points lay every decision the designers had made. The soldier swung open the loading gate on the right side of the receiver. He pressed cartridges down into the magazine box, one after another, up to 5. The rounds lay in a single curved column beneath a follower and a spring, each rim seated ahead of the one behind it so the flanges would not lock. He closed the gate. The spring pushed the column up and around the corner of the box, guiding the top cartridge toward the mouth of the action. With the cutoff open, the magazine was live and would feed on its own. With it closed, the column waited in reserve while the man fed single rounds by hand onto the carrier. He lifted the bolt handle. The single locking lug rotated up and out of its seat in the receiver, and the root of the handle came free of its shoulder. The camming surfaces did their work, and the primary extraction eased the fired case free of the chamber walls, breaking it loose with the leverage of the turning bolt. The motion was light, almost frictionless, the quality that made the rifle be loved by everyone who worked it. He drew the bolt fully rearward. The extractor dragged the empty case back along the receiver until the ejector caught it and flicked it clear, and the brass tumbled out to the side and fell away. As the bolt cleared the top cartridge in the magazine, the follower lifted a fresh round into its path. He drove the bolt forward. The face of the bolt caught the base of the cartridge and pushed it out of the magazine, up the feed ramp, and into the chamber. The round slid home and seated against the chamber shoulder. He turned the bolt handle down. The single lug rotated into its recess at the front, and the root of the handle dropped into its shoulder at the rear, adding a second bearing surface behind the lug. The action was locked, the cartridge sealed, the striker cocked and waiting. He pressed the trigger. The sear released the striker. The firing pin ran forward under spring pressure and struck the primer. The cartridge fired. 40 grains of smokeless powder drove a 220-grain bullet down the 30-inch barrel at roughly 2,000 feet per second. Pressure spiked against the bolt face in an instant, and the single lug held it, up to the ceiling the design allowed, and no further. The bullet left the muzzle. The smoke was thin and pale, a fraction of the old black powder cloud, and the shooter's position stayed nearly hidden where a trapdoors would have been marked in white. Then the cycle began again, and its ease was the whole point. He lifted the bolt, and the extractor pulled the spent case. He drew it back, and the ejector threw the brass clear. He ran the bolt forward over a fresh round, and it chambered. He locked it and fired. On the range, with the cutoff open and a steady rhythm, he could repeat the cycle fast enough to place 43 aimed shots in 2 minutes. The action never fought him. It flowed from one round to the next, and the smoothness that had won the board its confidence was the same smoothness the soldier felt in every stroke. The virtue of that cycle was reliability under a smooth hand. The Krag rarely balked. Its feeding was gentle, its extraction sure, its ejection clean. Soldiers who used it trusted it, and trust in a rifle is not given lightly. The action earned a reputation for smoothness that has outlived every other memory of the rifle. So that a century later, the first thing anyone says about a Krag is how the bolt feels. That reputation was earned, honestly, cycle after cycle, in hands that came to know the rifle well. One myth should be set aside. The Krag is sometimes described as a rifle that jammed constantly in service, a fragile thing forever binding up. The record does not support that picture. The action itself was dependable, and its cycle was among the most trouble-free of its generation. When the Krag failed a soldier, the failure was almost never the bolt. It was the speed of the reload. And that was a limit of the loading system, not a fault in the mechanism that fed and fired. That was the fixed cost written into the cycle. Every round entered the magazine by hand, through the side gate, because the geometry allowed no other path. A soldier could not press a clip of 5 into the top and slap the bolt shut over them. He fed cartridges one at a time, gate open, fingers working, and when a firefight ran hot and the magazine ran dry, those seconds stretched long. The smooth action that fed each round so beautifully could only be fed the slow way, and no drill could change what the rifle would not allow. There were quieter jobs the action did on the way. As the bolt turned down, it cocked the striker against its spring, storing the force the firing pin would need. The bolt face and the receiver ring enclosed the head of the cartridge, so that if a primer or a case ever failed, the escaping gas met steel rather than the shooter's eye. A small vent gave that gas somewhere to go. These were not the features anyone praised, but they were the difference between a rifle that merely fired and one a soldier could put to his cheek 1,000 times without fear. The rimmed cartridge asked for a particular care that the side gate was built to give. Because each round wore a flange at its base, 2 rounds stacked with the rear rim ahead of the front could catch on each other and stall the feed, a fault old hands called rim lock. The Krag's single curved column and its hand loading kept the rims in their proper order, one seated cleanly behind the next. The design tamed the rim, but it did so by insisting on the slow, deliberate loading that the whole rifle was built around. Even the shape of the cartridge pulled the Krag toward patience. The cause of any stoppage deserves the same fairness the rifle earned in its virtues. When feeding faltered, the fault might lie in a bent follower, a weak magazine spring, dirt worked into the box, a damaged case rim, a rim caught over another rim, or simply a tired hand fumbling a cartridge under fire. The action was sound. The bottleneck was the loading method, and the loading method was a direct consequence of the side gate the board had admired. That refinement now had to be reproduced 500,000 times over. A rifle chosen for the feel of its bolt had to survive the machinery of mass production, and Springfield Armory took up the task. Chapter 6. The 500,000 at Springfield. A rifle chosen for its finesse now had to survive the factory floor. Springfield Armory answered with volume. The National Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, was the home of American rifle production. It had built the trapdoor for decades and knew how to turn out arms in quantity, on schedule, to a pattern. The Krag was a harder task than the trapdoor had ever been. Its whole value lay in the smoothness of its action, and smoothness meant tight tolerances held across every part. A loose bolt was a poor Krag, no matter how well the rest was made. The Armory had to hold precision not on one rifle but on hundreds of thousands, and it had to hold it year after year. It did. Between 1894 and 1904, Springfield produced the Krag in numbers that reached across the whole service. By the surviving figures, the Armory built roughly 442,000 rifles and about 63,000 carbines. Taken together, more than 500,000 Krags left the line over the decade. Each one carried the $1 royalty owed to Krag and Jørgensen, a foreign debt stitched into every serial number and paid out of the national treasury with every rifle stamped and shipped. Production did not stand still while it ran. The rifle changed as the Armory learned its ways. The first pattern was the Model 1892, the rifle as adopted, with its cleaning rod carried in a channel beneath the barrel. Experience brought revisions. The Model 1896 moved the cleaning rod out of the forestock and into a hole bored in the butt, changed the rear sight for a better one, and tightened the fit of the parts. It shed a little weight in the process, dropping from near 9.5 pounds toward 9. None of these changes were dramatic on their own. Together they marked a design being refined by the people who built and issued it. The Model 1898 followed with further refinement still. It adjusted the bolt handle and the sight, and simplified several points of manufacture to speed the work and ease the assembly. There was a later carbine, the Model 1899, with a longer forestock and an added handguard, shaped by what the earlier carbines had taught. The differences between all these models were the differences of a design being polished in service, not reinvented from scratch. A soldier moving from a Model 1892 to a Model 1898 held a familiar rifle, a little better made, a little better sighted, still smooth in exactly the same way. A machinist on the Springfield floor stood at the center of the whole effort. His job was to hold the tolerances that made the action glide. A bolt cut a fraction loose, felt sloppy in the hand, and shamed the rifle's reputation. A bolt cut a fraction tight, bound up, and defeated the very quality the Krag was chosen for. The whole standing of the rifle rode on surfaces measured in thousandths of an inch, held by men at machines through long shifts. He held them, rifle after rifle, because the smoothness was the product. The Krag was not sold to the army by its power. It was sold by its feel, and feel had to be manufactured. One misconception is worth correcting. The carbines were a smaller but vital share of the work. Cavalry needed a shorter, lighter Krag they could handle from the saddle, and Springfield built better than 60,000 of them across the run, in the patterns of 1896 and 1899. Rifle and carbine shared the same action and the same cartridge, so the armory could build both on common tooling, and the field could supply both from a common stock of parts. That commonality was part of the plan. A single family of rifles, built to one standard, was easier to make, to feed, and to repair than a scattering of different arms. One point is worth setting straight, because accounts often blur it. Every American Krag was built at Springfield. No Krag was ever made at Rock Island Arsenal, which would tool up only later for the Springfield rifle that replaced it. That claim requires the same care as any other in the record. The Krag was a single armory's product from first to last, and the whole 500,000 came off one set of lines in one Massachusetts town. One misconception is worth correcting. The Krag is sometimes remembered as a stopgap built in small numbers before the real rifle arrived, a brief placeholder soon swept away. That claim requires restraint. 500,000 Krags is not a stopgap's total. The rifle armed the regular army through the 1890s and well beyond, and its production run stretched a full decade from first delivery to last. It was the standard rifle of the United States for that span, carried on the frontier, in Cuba, and across the Pacific. A placeholder does not get built 500,000 times. The cost of that quality showed in the pace of it. A rifle built to tight tolerances took time and care that a rougher rifle did not. Springfield's Krag was well made, and well made was slower than roughly made. A charger-loading rifle of simpler, stronger action could, in principle, be turned out faster on the line and fed faster in the field. The armory bought the Krag's precision with production effort, hour by hour, part by part. The advantage was a superb action that soldiers trusted. The price was the labor that superb actions demand, and the time that labor took. The heart of the armory's method was interchangeability. Every part of every Krag had to match a master gauge closely enough that a bolt from one rifle would serve in another, and a broken piece could be replaced from a bin rather than fitted by a gunsmith. Holding that standard on a smooth action was harder than holding it on a rough one, because the smoothness itself was a tolerance. The armory built the gauges, trained the inspectors, and checked the parts at every stage. A rifle that failed the gauge went back or went to scrap. That discipline had a cost measured in more than dollars. An error caught early cost a single component and a minute of a machinist's time. An error caught after assembly could stop a finished rifle and undo the work stacked on top of it. The armory learned to inspect early and often, because the later a fault surfaced, the more it cost to fix. The Krag was more rifle to build than the trapdoor had ever been, and every one of the 500,000 carried the hours of care that its smoothness demanded. None of that effort was wasted. The Krags that left Springfield were well made, uniform, and dependable, and the men who received them held rifles built to a standard the old armory could be proud of. That price had a second edge that only showed later. The precision that made the Krag smooth also made it particular. Its parts were fitted, its action refined, its whole character built around a feel that could not be rushed. When the time came to replace it, that refinement could not simply be sped up or bulked out into something new. A rifle defined by its finish is a rifle that resists the shortcut, and the Krag resisted it. The armory had built excellence, and excellence was not the same thing as adaptability. The same armory that perfected the Krag would soon learn a harder lesson about its cartridge, one no craftsmanship could fix. The rifle was as good as its makers could make it. The round it fired had a ceiling that no amount of Springfield care could raise. Chapter 7. The Cartridge with a Ceiling. The 3040 was modern the day it was born. It was dated within a decade, and its limit was written into the bolt. The cartridge was named, in the old style, for its bullet and its charge. It fired a .30 caliber bullet driven by 40 grains of smokeless powder, and the name 3040 followed the convention that had named the 4570 before it. It was also called the 30 Army, the round of the new rifle and the first small-bore smokeless cartridge the United States adopted. It launched a 220-grain bullet at roughly 2,000 feet per second from the rifle's 30-inch barrel. From the shorter carbine, with less barrel to burn its powder, the figure fell to about 1,920. Those numbers were good. In 1892, they were more than good. They put America, at last, among the smokeless armies. The bullet was heavy and round-nosed, a shape suited to its era and its velocity. It flew well at moderate range and struck with real authority when it arrived. Against the black powder trap door it replaced, the 3040 was a long step forward in every way that could be measured. It was faster, flatter, and cleaner burning, and its smoke was thin where the old rounds was thick. For its first years, the 3040 stood among the modern military cartridges of the world, the equal of what most armies carried, and the better of what many did. Its ceiling came from the rifle around it, not from the powder inside it. The Krag's single locking lug held the bolt closed against firing pressure, and one lug set a hard limit on how much pressure was safe. The action was rated near 40,000 pounds. The cartridge was loaded to stay beneath that number, and it could not be pushed past it without asking the single lug to hold more than it should. The round's performance was capped not by what its powder could do, but by what its rifle's lock could bear. The cartridge was a prisoner of the action, and the action's warden was one small lug of steel. That cap mattered because rivals had chosen otherwise at the start. The Mauser of the same period locked its bolt with 2 forward lugs, and 2 lugs held far more pressure than one. A Mauser cartridge could be loaded hotter, driving a lighter bullet much faster and flatter across the ground. The Spanish Model 1893 Mauser fired a 7mm bullet at roughly 2,330 feet per second, some 300 feet per second faster than the 3040, and its sights were graduated out past 2,000 meters. That gap was not a detail for the specialists. It was the difference between 2 philosophies of the bolt action, and it showed itself in the trajectory a bullet followed and the range at which it still bit. The Army did try to raise its own ceiling, and the attempt shows the trade in sharpest relief. In 1899, the 3040 was reloaded to a higher standard, pushed toward 2,200 feet per second at a pressure near 45,000 pounds. The hotter load closed a little of the gap on paper. It also leaned harder on the single lug that was never built for it, and the harder-driven round pressed an action already at its limit. The fix that chased more speed pressed on the very weakness the design could not cure. The only real cure lay in a stronger lock, and a stronger lock meant a different rifle. A cavalry trooper felt the difference without ever seeing its cause. He carried the carbine, a handier rifle with a 22-inch barrel at about 7 3/4 pounds, easy to carry and quick to bring up from the saddle. Its short barrel also bled velocity, dropping the bullet's speed further below the rifle's and its reach along with it. The trooper's weapon was pleasant in the hand and outranged before he ever knew a fight had a longer edge to it. He would learn where that edge was only when someone on the far side had a rifle that reached across it. One myth deserves correction. The 3040 is sometimes dismissed as an underpowered cartridge, a weak round from the start. That claim requires restraint. For its time, it was a capable, hard-hitting cartridge, and it served for decades afterward as a fine round for deer and larger game. It was not weak in any absolute sense. It was merely bounded, held below its rivals by the single lug action it was married to at birth. The powder always had more to give. The bolt did not, and the bolt had the final say. The difference between the 2 cartridges went deeper than speed. The Mauser's round was rimless, its base cut with a groove instead of a flange, and rimless rounds stacked and fed without the risk of catching rim on rim. That shape was what let the Mauser load cleanly from a stripper clip, 5 rounds pressed straight down without a thought for their order. The Krag's rimmed round could not be trusted to that treatment, and so the rifle around it could not use the clip even if the magazine had allowed it. The cartridge and the loading system were locked together, and both pointed back to the slow gate on the side. At close range, the gap looked small. At distance, it opened wide. The faster, flatter Mauser bullet dropped less over a given stretch of ground, so a Spanish rifleman could hold dead on a target the American had to hold high above. Every error in judging range punished the slower bullet more. On a bare hillside, where the fight was decided by who could reach whom first and hit him, those extra hundreds of feet per second bought the Mauser the opening exchanges. The Krag's shooter was not outclassed as a marksman. He was handed a rifle that reached a little less far and arrived a little slower, and against a good enemy, that was enough. The trade ran the length of the rifle, from the muzzle to the lug. The single lug bought the Krag its smoothness, and the smoothness was the rifle's soul and its selling point. The same lug set the pressure ceiling, and the ceiling set the cartridge's limit, and the limit set the range at which the rifle could fight. To praise the Krag's action is to name the reason its cartridge could not keep pace. The virtue and the flaw were the same piece of steel, and no one could have the one without the other. On the proving ground, none of this was visible. On paper, the Krag and its cartridge looked modern and complete. The gap between it and the Mauser was a matter of numbers on a table, abstract until an enemy made it concrete. That enemy was waiting in the Caribbean, armed with a rifle that had chosen 2 lugs. The figures would stop being abstract in June of 1898, on the beaches and ridges of Cuba. Chapter 8. A Splendid Little War. America went to Cuba with 2 rifles and a shortage of the good one. Most of its volunteers still carried smoke. The war with Spain came fast in 1898. The United States mobilized a small, regular army and a large body of volunteers in a matter of weeks, and it sent them toward Cuba faster than it could arm them uniformly. The regular army carried the Krag. It was the modern rifle, smokeless and repeating, and there were not enough of them to go around a force swelling by the day. The volunteers, raised in a rush from state units, carried what the arsenals could spare. For many of them, that meant the old 45-70 trapdoor, the single-shot black powder rifle the Krag had been chosen to replace 6 years before. The mix mattered from the first shot fired. A volunteer regiment armed with trapdoors carried a rifle a full generation behind the enemy. It fired one round at a time through a hinged breech. It threw white smoke with every shot into the wet Cuban air. On a hillside in the tropics, that smoke marked the firing line as plainly as a raised flag, and it hung there in the heat. The men who carried the old rifle were visible in a way the enemy was not, and they were visible every time they pulled a trigger. The rifle that had made sense on the frontier was a liability in this war before the shooting even settled into a pattern. The enemy carried the Spanish Model 1893 Mauser. Spain had adopted it on the 7th of December, 1893, the same season America was confirming the Krag, and the two nations had chosen in the same window and chosen differently. The Mauser locked with 2 forward lugs and fired the fast 7mm round. It loaded 5 cartridges at once. From a stripper clip pressed into the top of the open action, the whole magazine filled in a single motion. Its box sat flush with the stock, staggered and neat, fed from above. It burned smokeless powder that left almost no trace in the air. The Spanish infantryman was well armed with a modern rifle, and he knew how to use it. The American landing began at Daiquiri and pushed inland toward Santiago through heat and brush. The first serious contact came at Las Guasimas on the 24th of June, in the tangled country of the interior. There the Americans met the Mauser for the first time and learned what smokeless powder meant in the hands of a hidden enemy. Theodore Roosevelt, leading his volunteer cavalry, described the experience of being fired on by men he could not locate. He wrote that the Spanish were entirely invisible, that not the faintest trace of smoke revealed where the fire was coming from. The bullets arrived from a tree line that showed nothing at all. A volunteer with a trapdoor stood at the losing end of that exchange. He fired his single shot, and his own smoke rose at once to mark him for the men across the field. Return fire came from cover that gave away nothing. He broke the action, thumbed in another cartridge, and fired again, and again the smoke betrayed him while the enemy stayed hidden behind his clean-burning powder. The rifle in his hands was not merely old, it was a beacon that told the enemy exactly where to shoot, one deliberate puff of white at a time. The pattern repeated a few miles away at El Caney on the same 1st of July. There, a small Spanish garrison held a fortified village against a full American division for most of the day. A few hundred defenders with modern rifles, dug in and firing without smoke, held up thousands of attackers far longer than the numbers said they should. The fight at El Caney was meant to be quick and was not, and the reason was the same reason. It was slow everywhere in Cuba. Modern rifles in cover, firing without a telltale cloud, made every yard of open ground expensive. One misconception is worth correcting. The common picture shows every American soldier in Cuba carrying the Krag, a modern army against a backward one. The record shows otherwise. The modern rifle was rationed to the regular army, and many volunteer units went into the fight with the black powder trapdoor in their hands. The American force was not a single well-armed body. It was a modern army and an obsolete one, marching and fighting side by side, and the obsolete half paid a price the histories often skip over. The trade behind that mix was one of numbers against quality. Fielding both rifles let the nation put more men into the field faster than the Krag supply alone would have allowed, and speed mattered in a war declared and fought within a single season. That was a real advantage, honestly gained. The cost was that thousands of Americans carried a rifle 2 decades out of date against a modern enemy who could see them and could not be seen. The advantage was mass. The price was paid by the men holding the old guns, in a currency of exposure they could not avoid. The volunteers came from the states, from National Guard regiments and hastily raised units, and they came faster than modern rifles could be issued to them. There were simply not enough Krags for a war that grew from a standing army of a few tens of thousands into a force many times that in a single summer. So the old trapdoors came out of storage and went south, and whole regiments of Americans carried into a smokeless war a rifle that fought in clouds of white. On the firing line, the two eras stood together, and the enemy could tell them apart by the smoke. At Las Guasimas, the shock was as much moral as physical. Men used to seeing an enemy's position by his smoke found themselves fired on from a landscape that gave nothing away. The bullets cracked past from nowhere in particular, and the instinct to shoot back at a puff of smoke found no puff to aim at. It was a new kind of fear, the fear of an enemy who could not be located, and it fell hardest on the volunteers whose own rifles announced them with every shot. The Mauser did not only kill more efficiently, it fought from a concealment the Americans could not match or even see into. Even the Krag-armed regulars faced a subtler disadvantage against the Mauser. Their rifle was smokeless and modern, and it outclassed the trapdoor in every way. Against the Mauser, though, it gave up velocity, and above all, it gave up speed of reloading. The regular fed his Krag 1 round at a time through the side gate. The Spaniard fed his Mauser 5 at a stroke from a clip. In a firefight measured in seconds, that difference set the tempo of the exchange, and the tempo belonged to Spain. On the 1st of July, outside Santiago, the two philosophies of the rifle met on a single ridge, and what happened there would decide how history remembered the Krag. Chapter 9. The Invisible Enemy. Roughly 760 Spanish regulars held a hill against more than 8,000 Americans. The rifle was the reason it took so long. The ground was the San Juan Heights, above the road that ran into Santiago. On the 1st of July, 1898, an American force of some 8,400 men advanced against Spanish positions strung along the ridge. The defenders numbered around 760 regulars on the hill itself, with larger reserves held back inside the city. On the raw numbers alone, the fight was a mismatch, Americans over Spaniards by roughly 16-1. The numbers alone did not tell the story of the day, because the story was not written in numbers of men. It was written in the reach and the rate of the rifles. The Spanish held the high ground and carried the Mauser. Their smokeless powder left their positions nearly invisible, so that the fire came down the slope from an enemy the attackers could not find to shoot back at. Their fast rifles laid a heavy, flat stream of bullets across the open approaches. American units advancing over ground with no cover came under fire from men they could not see and could only press forward into it. The soldiers gave the worst of it grim names. One exposed stretch they called Hell's Pocket, a place of constant Mauser fire with no clear target to answer and nowhere to hide from it. The advance pressed on regardless of the cost. Regular regiments and volunteer units climbed the slope under fire. The Rough Riders, Roosevelt's volunteer cavalry, went up the neighboring Kettle Hill with their Krag carbines. The Buffalo soldiers of the black regular regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry, were in the thick of the fighting and paid heavily for their part in it. Lieutenant John Parker brought forward a detachment of 4 Gatling guns and poured mechanical fire onto the Spanish line, and that fire did what individual rifles could not. It beat down the defenders' heads long enough for the infantry to cross the last of the open ground and close with the trenches. The cost of the climb was severe. American losses at San Juan Hill came to 144 killed, 1,024 wounded, and 72 missing. The Spanish, firing from cover with modern rifles, lost 58 killed and 366 wounded before the position finally fell. A defending force, outnumbered many times over, had inflicted casualties far out of proportion to its size, and the rifle, in Spanish hands, was central to how it did so. The Americans took the hill. They took it at a price the rifle set for them. For the men in the open, the fight was a lesson in what a rifle could and could not do. Their own Krags were smooth and accurate, and they shot back as well as the ground allowed, but accuracy meant little against an enemy who left no mark to aim at. A rifleman needs a target, and the Spanish gave him none. The Americans returned fire toward the crest, toward muzzle flashes and guesses, while the Mausers answered from cover with a steady, unhurried stream. It was not that the American soldier shot poorly. It was that the whole exchange had been arranged, by the rifles, in the enemy's favor. Here, the whole legend of the story demands restraint. The framing speaks of a rifle that lost America a war, and of Mausers that humiliated the Krag. The record supports the humiliation of the firefight and denies the loss of the war. America won at San Juan Hill. America won the war, and won it quickly, and took Spain's empire in the Caribbean and the Pacific in a matter of months. The Krag did not lose the war. It lost the exchange of fire on the slope, and it lost the argument that came after. Those are different defeats, and honesty keeps them apart. A rifle can be outshot in a battle, its army still wins. The casualty figures themselves must be handled with the same care. Sources differ on the exact tallies for the day and for the wider campaign. Some accounts count the losses of the whole San Juan operation, some only of the single hill, and some of the broader week of fighting around Santiago, and the numbers shift with the boundary drawn. The figures cited here follow the fullest surviving accounts of the battle, and other credible sources place them somewhat higher or lower. The disagreement does not change the shape of the day. A small, well-armed force in good cover held up a large one in the open and made it bleed for the ground. The rifle's part in that bleeding was specific and can be named. The Mauser's smokeless powder hid the shooter from the men he was hitting. Its 7mm round flew fast and flat and reached the climbing Americans with force to spare. Its stripper clip let a defender reload 5 rounds in the time an American fed one through a side gate. Every one of those advantages ran against a Krag-armed regular, and everyone ran far harder against a trapdoor-armed volunteer. The Spaniard on the ridge could see, shoot, and reload faster than the man coming up the hill at him, and for a long and costly stretch of that day it showed. The Gatling guns were the answer the rifles could not give. Lieutenant John Parker had pushed to bring them forward against the doubts of officers who saw them as a novelty, and on the slope they proved him right. 4 guns, cranked steadily, threw a volume of fire no line of riflemen could match, and they walked that fire across the Spanish trenches at the crest. The defenders, who had been firing down in comfort, now had to keep their heads down, and in the minutes they did, the American infantry crossed the ground that had been killing them. It was machine fire, not marksmanship, that broke the deadlock the rifles had made. The Spanish on the heights fought until the position was untenable and, in places, until their ammunition ran low, and then they fell back toward the city. They had done what a small force in good cover with modern rifles could do, which was to make a large force pay dearly and to hold far longer than their numbers promised. The Americans held the crest by evening, and the road to Santiago lay open. The victory was real, and the ground was taken. The lesson underneath it was just as real. A handful of riflemen with the right rifle had nearly held a hill against 16 times their number, and every officer who climbed that slope carried the arithmetic home. The trade that the army had chosen years earlier came due on that slope, all at once. The Krag's aimed fire doctrine and its careful single loading had been chosen for discipline, and discipline had genuine value in the world the army had imagined. Against a hidden enemy firing fast from cover, discipline alone was not enough. The advantage of control met the advantage of volume and concealment, and control paid the difference in the open. The men who climbed San Juan Hill settled the doctrine's account with their bodies. The survivors carried the lesson home, and among them was a man who would soon have the ear of the nation, and he did not intend to let the rifle question rest. Chapter 10. The Board That Buried It. The Krag was condemned not on a firing range, but in an after-action report. The verdict was a new rifle. The war ended in the summer of 1898, and the reckoning began almost before the guns had cooled. Officers who had fought in Cuba wrote up what they had seen, and the complaint was consistent from one report to the next. The Spanish Mauser had outranged, outloaded, and outhidden the American rifles. The Krag was smooth and accurate, and none of that had closed the gap on the slope, because the gap was not a matter of smoothness. The rifle that had won 2 boards in the early 1890s now faced a board of a different kind, one convened to judge it not against peacetime rivals but against the enemy it had actually met in the field. The critics were not obscure men easy to ignore. Theodore Roosevelt had led his men up Kettle Hill under Mauser fire, and he came home a national figure with strong and public opinions about rifles. He and others who had been there pressed for a weapon that matched what Spain had fielded. They wanted the velocity of the 7mm round and, above all, they wanted the speed of the stripper clip. The army listened, because the men making the argument had climbed the hill and buried the dead, and their words carried the authority of the ground. The Ordnance Department turned to study the rifle that had beaten it. American engineers took the Mauser apart and learned it closely, because the Mauser had answered the questions the Krag could not. The result was the Springfield Model 1903. It locked with 2 forward lugs, like the Mauser. It loaded from a stripper clip pressed into the top of the action, like the Mauser. It fired a new, high-velocity cartridge that would soon settle into the form remembered as the 3006, adopted in its final shape in 1906. In feature after feature, the new American rifle followed the design that had humbled the Krag in Cuba. The resemblance was close enough to carry a bill. The Springfield borrowed so directly from the Mauser system that the matter reached the question of patents, and patents reached the question of money. In the years that followed, the United States government paid a settlement to the Mauser firm to resolve claims over the borrowed design. The sums named in various accounts differ, with figures around $200,000 commonly cited, and the exact settlement is disputed among sources. That claim requires restraint, and the precise number should be left open. The direction, though, is not in doubt. America paid the German firm for the ideas built into its own new rifle. The replacement did not happen overnight. The Springfield was adopted in 1903, but rifles took years to build and issue, and the Krag stayed in many hands well after the new rifle's name was set. For a stretch, the 2 rifles served side by side, the old and its answer, while Springfield tooled up and the arsenals filled. The changeover cost money and time on a scale that dwarfed the original $400,000, because a nation was not buying one rifle now but rearming an army. The Krag had been expensive to adopt. It proved expensive to leave. An image from the ordnance rooms captures the whole moment in one frame. American officers stood over a captured Spanish Mauser, taking it apart on a bench to learn what had beaten their own men in the field. The rifle they studied was the enemy's, and the rifle they built from the study was that enemy's student. There is no shame in the picture, only the plain fact that the loser of the firefight became the teacher of the next design. The Krag had shown, at a price, exactly what a modern service rifle needed. The Mauser had shown how to build it. One myth deserves correction here. The Springfield 1903 is often remembered as a purely American triumph, a homegrown answer that set the world standard. That claim requires restraint. The Springfield was an excellent rifle, among the finest bolt actions any army ever carried, and Americans have every reason to be proud of what it became in their hands. It was also, in its core mechanism, a Mauser by another name, and the government paid for the privilege of building it. Popular retellings celebrate the rifle and quietly omit the debt. The record shows both the excellence and the invoice, and both are true at once. The trade in this chapter was national rather than mechanical. Copying the winner gave America a world-class rifle in a few short years instead of a slow generation of its own trials and errors. That was a real gain, bought cheaply in time. The cost was a blow to national pride and a payment to the supplier of a former enemy. The Army bought its way to the front of the field by admitting, in steel and in dollars, that it had been behind. The advantage was the Springfield, a rifle that would serve for decades. The price was the acknowledgement written into the settlement and the quiet fact that the standard had been set abroad. The road to the new rifle was not smooth, and Roosevelt shaped it more than once. The first Springfield of 1903 was fitted with a thin rod bayonet that slid from beneath the barrel, and when Roosevelt, by then president, handled it, he condemned the flimsy spike in blunt terms and demanded it be replaced. The Army redrew the rifle to take a proper knife bayonet, and the pattern that emerged a couple of years later was the better for his objection. The man who had climbed San Juan Hill under Mauser fire kept his hand on the rifle that answered it. The cartridge, too, took a second try to get right. The 1903 rifle first fired a round with a heavy, round-nosed bullet, much like the Krag's, and within 3 years the Army saw that Europe had moved again, to light, pointed bullets that flew flatter and farther. In 1906, it adopted the pointed cartridge remembered as the .30-06, and only then did the American rifle and its round stand fully abreast of the best in the world. The lesson of Cuba had been learned, but learning it took a new rifle, a new bayonet, and 2 tries at the cartridge. Through all of it, the Krag was the measure of what had gone wrong. Every improvement in the Springfield answered a fault the Krag had shown at a price in Cuba, and in that sense the old rifle wrote the specification for the new one. The Krag's condemnation at home was now complete. It had been chosen twice and rejected once, and this rejection was final for the front line. Yet the rifle did not vanish the moment the Springfield arrived. 500,000 of them existed, and 500,000 rifles do not disappear on a board's signature. Across the Pacific, in islands taken from Spain in the same war, the Krag was already fighting a longer and quieter campaign, and there the verdict on it read very differently from the one written in Washington. Chapter 11. The Short Krags of the Philippines. The rifle that failed the headline test in Cuba served for years in the islands. There, the men who carried it liked it. The war with Spain had given the United States the Philippines, and possession brought a long and bitter fight. The Philippine-American War began in 1899 and ground on for years, and it was followed by drawn-out campaigns against the Moro peoples in the south that lasted well past it, into the years around 1913. Through all of it, the Krag was the American rifle in the islands. The Springfield was coming, but the Krag was already there, in the hands of soldiers who used it hard across jungle, mountain, and paddy in a war of ambush and patrol. The Krag also went farther afield in these years. When the Boxer Uprising threatened the foreign legations in China, American troops joined the international relief that marched to Peking in 1900, and they carried the Krag with them. The rifle served in that expedition as it served in the islands, in the hands of regulars far from home. The weapon condemned by the board in Washington was, at the very moment of its condemnation, the standard arm of American soldiers on 2 sides of the Pacific. In this kind of war, the Krag showed its better face. Its action was smooth and reliable, in a climate that punished equipment with damp and rot and grit. Its recoil was mild, which helped a soldier shoot it well when marksmanship counted, and steadiness mattered more than speed. Its accuracy was genuine, and often decisive at the ranges these fights were settled. The loading speed that had cost so much against massed Mauser fire in Cuba mattered far less in the scattered, close, unpredictable fighting of the islands. Men who carried the Krag through the Philippines often spoke well of it, and their regard was earned in service, not granted on paper. The rifle also adapted to the place and the people who carried it. The Army modified carbines for the conditions and for smaller-framed troops. It created a pattern officially titled the magazine carbine, model 1899, altered for a knife bayonet and a gunsling. The changes lengthened the forestock, added an upper handguard to protect the hand from a hot barrel, and fitted a barrel band that could mount a bayonet. The result was a short, handy rifle better suited to a foot soldier than the plain cavalry carbine had ever been, a Krag reshaped by the lessons of the field. Those short Krags found a particular home in the Philippine Constabulary. Around 1906, under Captain Henry T. Allen, the chief of the constabulary, the force armed its indigenous counterinsurgency troops with shortened Krags sized for the men who would carry them. The modifications suited smaller frames, and the rifles kept features the standard carbine lacked. Between 1906 and 1916, A facility in Manila produced roughly 5,000 of these altered carbines for constabulary use. They often differed from the Springfield-built rifles in their sights and handguards, local variants of a national arm made in the islands for the island's own war. The same modification effort reached the training grounds back home. In the same decade, the Army produced around 3,371 so-called school guns from Krag rifles, arms adapted for cadet instruction and the teaching of drill. The Krag, retired from the front line, was teaching a new generation how to handle a service rifle, how to work a bolt and hold a sight picture. Its afterlife as an instructor had begun while its combat career was still winding down in the islands and on the China Road. The rifle taught even as it was being replaced. One misconception is worth correcting. The rifle turned up wherever American soldiers went in those years. It had gone ashore in Samoa during the troubles there, stood watch in China after the relief of the legations, and patrolled the length of the Philippine archipelago. For a rifle written off at home, it kept remarkably busy abroad. The Krag was the arm of American soldiers across the Pacific at the very moment its own country was building its successor, and the men who carried it in those far places were not fighting the last war. They were fighting the wars the nation actually had, with the rifle it actually owned. One misconception is worth correcting. The Krag is often remembered simply as the rifle everyone hated after Cuba, a failure cast aside in disgust. That claim requires restraint. In the Philippines, its smoothness, its accuracy, and its reliability earned real loyalty among the men who used it every day. The rifle that lost the argument in Washington kept a following in the field, among soldiers who cared less about a board's verdict than about how a weapon behaved in their hands on a bad morning. A weapon can be judged obsolete by a committee and trusted by a soldier at the same time, and the Krag was both at once. The fighting in the southern islands was some of the hardest the Army knew. A long campaign against determined Moro warriors in jungle and mountain that ran for years. There, the Krag's virtues counted for more than its famous flaw. A rifle that stayed smooth and sure in heat and wet, that a tired man could work without thought, was worth a great deal in country where a fight came without warning and ended fast. The slow reload that had cost so much against massed fire in Cuba mattered little in an ambush settled in seconds at close range. The Krag was, for that war, a better fit than its reputation allowed. The rifle's foreign kin outlasted the American one by decades. Norway kept its Krags in service far into the 20th century, and Norwegian soldiers still carried them when Germany invaded in 1940, more than half a century after Ole Krag first drew the action. Denmark, too, held its Krags for a generation. The design the American board had reached abroad to buy proved durable in the very armies it had come from, long after Springfield had turned to the Mauser's pattern. A rifle judged obsolete in one country served on in others, which is its own kind of verdict on the design. The trade in the islands was a quieter version of the old one. Keeping the Krag in colonial service gave the Army a proven, gentle, accurate rifle it already had in hand by the hundreds of thousands, and that was a practical advantage in a long, dispersed, low-intensity war. The cost was living with the dated loading system, the same side gate and single feed that had been so cruelly exposed on the ridges of Cuba. In the slower fighting of the Philippines, the cost was bearable, and the advantage was real, and the balance between them tipped the other way from how it had tipped at San Juan Hill. The rifle suited the war it was left to fight. As the Springfield took over the front line at home, the great stock of Krags began to move again, out of service and toward storage, surplus, and the civilian world. The rifle's second life was about to begin, and it would outlast its first. Chapter 12. The Afterlife and the Verdict. The Krag's second life ran longer than its first. The rifle that lost the argument won a following. The Springfield replaced the Krag on the front line, and the Krags went into storage by the trainload. There they waited in large numbers, oiled and racked, for whatever the Army might need them for next. By 1917, as the United States entered the World War, roughly 150,000 Krags still remained in stores. They were no longer the fighting rifle of the first line, but they were far from idle. Through the war, they served mainly for training, arming, and drilling men who would carry other rifles into France. The Krag taught the bolt action to a whole generation of soldiers, a full generation after it had first been chosen at Governor's Island. After the war, the surplus flowed out to the public. The government sold Krags into the civilian market through the programs meant to put good rifles into the hands of citizen shooters, and shooters found in them exactly what soldiers had prized. The action was smooth, the accuracy good, the recoil mild and forgiving. A rifle designed from the start for careful aimed fire made a fine rifle for a careful civilian shot. The Krag passed from the arsenal rack to the private gun rack, and it was welcome there in a way it had never quite been on the battlefield of 1898. Civilians remade the rifle to their own uses, as civilians do. Gunsmiths cut down the long military stocks and reshaped the rifles into sporters, lighter and handier arms for the hunting field. The 30-40 cartridge, capped and dated as a military round, made a solid hunting cartridge with no ceiling to worry a hunter. It took deer and larger game cleanly at sensible ranges, and it did so out of that same smooth action. The very qualities that had bounded the Krag in war, its moderate pressure and its heavy round-nosed bullet, made it a comfortable and effective sporting round in peace. The rifle found a second career in the deer camp, and it kept it for decades. Collectors, in time, gave it a third life. The Krag's decade of production had left a long trail of variations behind it. There were the models and the submodels, the rifles and the carbines, the changing sights and safeties and handguards, the arsenal conversions and the short constabulary carbines made in Manila. Serial numbers mapped the years of production onto the rifles that survived, so that a Krag could be read like a date stamp. The variety that had come from a design polished across a decade in service became a field of patient study for those who gathered the rifles up and sorted them. A weapon retired from war became an object of quiet scholarship. A hunter, decades later, held the sum of all that history in his hands, without needing to know any of it. He worked the bolt of a sporterized Krag, cut down and restocked for the woods, and it ran with the same fluid ease that had won over a board of officers in 1892. The rifle around the action had changed almost past recognition. The action itself had not. The smoothness that had defined the Krag from its very first trial defined it still. Long after the arguments about doctrine and velocity and stripper clips had gone quiet and the men who made them had died, the bolt still felt the way it had always felt. One final myth deserves correction. The Krag is often filed away as a plain failure, the rifle that lost to the Mauser and got itself thrown out. That claim requires restraint. The Krag proved a requirement rather than simply failing a test. It demonstrated, in the hardest and most costly way, that a modern service rifle needed smokeless power, high velocity, and fast charger loading all at once, and that a rifle missing any one of the three would pay for the gap in blood. The Springfield met that requirement, and it met it precisely because the Krag had shown, at San Juan Hill, what happened when a rifle lacked a piece of it. A weapon that defines the standard for its successor is not a failure. It is a lesson written in the price of learning it. The trade that ran through the whole story ran through its end as well, unchanged to the last. The Krag's refinement was its glory and its limit in one and the same feature. The smoothness that made it beloved as a sporter was the single lug smoothness that had capped its cartridge and doomed it in war. The gentle action a hunter admired at his leisure was the gentle action that could not be fed fast enough on a Cuban slope with men falling around it. The advantage and the cost were never separate things to be weighed against each other. They were the same rifle, seen in two different wars, by two kinds of men who each judged it fairly and reached opposite verdicts. The Krag was built for the war the army expected. It was broken by the war the army got, and it was loved by the peace that followed. All three verdicts are true, and they belong together. In 1890, the United States Army still fought with smoke. Its rifle was a single-shot relic that marked every man who fired it, and Europe had already moved a generation ahead into smokeless magazines. The nation set out to fix that, and the fix became the Krag Jørgensen. The requirement was a modern rifle, and the answer came from abroad. A board tested 53 designs and chose a Norwegian one, then was made to choose it again under protest, and Congress paid for it $1 at a time. The rifle carried a philosophy inside it. A magazine cutoff held 5 rounds in reserve while a soldier fired single shots by hand, because the army trusted the aimed shot over the emptied magazine. A single locking lug gave the rifle the smoothest action in any service, and the same lug capped the pressure its cartridge could bear. Springfield built more than 500,000, refining the rifle across a decade into the models 1892, 1896, and 1898. Then the war came. In Cuba, the Krag met the Spanish Mauser, which locked with 2 lugs, fired a faster round, loaded 5 at a stroke from a clip, and hid its shooter behind smokeless powder. At San Juan Hill, roughly 760 Spaniards held up more than 8,000 Americans and made them pay in blood for the ground. America won the hill, and won the war, and took an empire. The Krag lost the firefight and the argument, and an ordnance board replaced it with the Springfield, 1903, a rifle so close to the Mauser that the government paid a settlement for it. The answer to the question posed at the start is now plain. A nation cannot choose its rifle for a war that has not happened. It can only choose for the war it imagines. The army imagined disciplined lines and deliberate aimed fire, and the Krag was a nearly perfect answer to that vision. History declined to fight the imagined war. It sent instead a hidden enemy with a faster rifle and a quicker reload, and the perfect answer to the wrong question became a lesson written in casualties on an open slope. Yet the rifle outlived its own defeat. It served on in the Philippines and on the China Road, where the men who carried it came to trust it. It trained a generation for the World War. It went home at last, to the hunting camp and the collector's rack, its action as smooth in peace as it had ever been in war. The Krag proved the standard its successor would have to meet, and the Springfield met it, and both facts are one story. The army built the Krag to make soldiers shoot slowly and well. History put it in front of men who shot fast and could not be seen.